Great. Thank you so much. So we're going to start. There's people online who hopefully can hear us. And thank you to people who have come and joined us in the room. I think we're going to start because otherwise we'll run over the next session. So let's go for it. So welcome to this session on financing inclusion for refugees. The purpose of this is really looking at how financing in education specifically speaks to the need to include refugees in national systems and where those needs are different from maybe some of the more traditional approaches to financing education in crisis. I'm Becky Telford, I'm UNHCR's Global Chief of Education, and I'm really pleased to introduce the panel. So we're here also because we recognise that full and meaningful refugee inclusion requires significant investment. We're already at the point where it's stretching resources of countries, even those with relatively high levels of financial stability. A study conducted by the World Bank and UNHCR estimated that the cost of having every refugee learner included in national systems would cost $4.85 billion annually. This means tapping into new approaches to include refugees into education financing from development and government partners and looking at innovative solutions, as well as ensuring joined up approaches to planning, delivery and budgeting across the humanitarian development nexus. Over the last year, many countries in Europe have accommodated refugee learners from Ukraine and have needed to establish additional classrooms, appoint teachers and put in place language experts and other wraparound and remedial support. And this has been against the backdrop of existing teacher shortages in some countries. The important thing to note is that refugee hosting countries cannot carry the costs alone. The Global Compact on Refugees emphasises the need for international solidarity to enable hosting governments to meet the generous policy commitments that they have already made. Whilst high-income countries are more able to meet these responsibilities, 85% of refugees are hosted in low and lower middle-income countries. Education Cannot Wait, as we've been hearing today, plays a really key role in bridging emergency responses at the start of a crisis, with longer-term investments in education systems that enable them to be better prepared to respond to refugee needs. Building on the joint pledge by ECW, the World Bank and the Global Partnership for Education at the GRF 2019, the Global Refugee Forum, which is in December, also in this building, so looking forward to welcoming you back. It's important to advance and deepen the efforts to find complementarity between funding packages and mechanisms and ensuring the explicit inclusion of refugees and their hosting communities into major programmes. So with that very brief scene setting, I'm really pleased to start with the panel. So Maki, I'm going to turn to you. Maki Katsuno Hayashikawa, sorry, Director of the Division of Education 2030 from UNESCO. Maki, we're talking about the kind of overall education architecture and how things are looking globally. And obviously UNESCO led the charge last year with the Transforming Education Summit. And that really recognized the specific critical needs in education in crisis situations, as well as including in the call to action on education financing, the need to agree on a new international collective approach to financing of education for refugees and other learners displaced by climate catastrophes. And that wording was in there to look at addressing the distinct education needs and financing needs of displaced and refugee children. What are the key relevant calls to action from TESS that the international community can get behind? Thank you.
This is it. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Becky, for that, and hello to all the participants, and I'm very happy to be joining this panel. Maybe first, let me recall that the Transforming Education Summit, TESS, there were actually 6 calls to action announced, which led to launching of 5 global initiatives. And one of the calls, of course, is on education financing, as you just mentioned, Becky. But then, of course, there were calls on greening education and transformation, gender equality in education, digital transformation, and foundational literacy and numeracy. But I do think that the dedicated call to action on education emergency and protracted crisis, or we call it a partnership for transformation, was in many ways a landmark call. This call to action was the outcome of an extensive consultation with over 45 countries, affected countries, youth, 100 international and national civil society organizations and private sectors, and was endorsed over 30 countries already at the time when the test took part. But I'm not saying that this is a landmark call because of the extensive consultation we did, but because we were really able to bring the highest political attention to EIPC as an integral part of education policy dialogue, promoting the triple nexus approaches, putting refugees and displaced population at the center of a dialogue discussions on education. Now, we know that despite education, is really under major threat today, education systems are under immense strain because we still have a record number of displacement this year. We've been also talking about the 222 million children and learners. There's increasing incidence of attacks against learning institutions, education personnel, and yet EIPC is seriously underfunded. I mean, some recent data we have is only 22% of the humanitarian appeals in 2021 goes to education, only 2.9% of global humanitarian financing also goes to education. Only 3% of total stimulus packages in response to COVID-19 will actually address the specific cause of needs of education. Partly maybe because the response is often kind of short-term and fragmented across different sectors, but I think there's also other concerns. Now, I would like to specifically focus, of course, here on the inclusion of refugees case in national education systems. Over the last decade, we would say that large refugee hosting countries have removed or reduced legal administrative barriers to refugee inclusion in national education system. This is a very good news. It's good, a positive development, and it has been both cemented and acknowledged in the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018. And I think this is the focus is really about, responsibility sharing. Now, however, in low middle income countries, as you were mentioning, I mean, where largely all the 83% of refugees are hosted globally, the inclusion policies still remain very far behind. We know that refugees should be and must be included in national planning, a costing exercise, with the international community finding new ways to support the cost, especially where refugees remain outside of the national systems of financing and is required to move the needle on inclusion. Now, we know that predictable multi-year financing and disseminated through appropriate mechanism, it should be there in line with the national education sector approaches. This is a major transformation that will be required to improve equitable access to quality education for refugees and communities, host community alike. So the Partnership for Transformation for EIEPC aims to address persisting challenges by advocating collectively for access to education and quality of learning, sustained improved financing, as I mentioned, multi-sector response and improved coordination between humanitarian development responses, the triple nexus, and evidence-based and high-impact solutions. The call to action makes clear reference to key elements of all these call to actions are combined, but with a practical focus on learners who are often not accounted for and equitably not within the national planning or budgeting. Now, I could also say that the call to actions, the other 5 calls to action, do include specific reference to prioritizing the most marginalized and vulnerable population, especially refugees and displaced learners. The call to action on gender equality resolves to ensure safe, gender transformative, and inclusive learning spaces to address immediate needs in the context of global hunger crisis and take medium-term efforts, particularly in emergency crisis contexts where vulnerabilities are most pronounced. Recognizing that connectivity and technology often negatively impact on the disadvantaged population by widening the digital divide. The call to action on digital learning resolves to prioritize marginalized learners here, again, particularly on refugees and people on the move, and to supporting their meaningful inclusion into expansion national systems. The call to greening education also account for the population who are climate change-induced refugees and displaced population. Now, very few countries today explicitly prevent refugees from attending national schools. That's an enormous change since 10 years ago, but positive policy environment does not automatically mean inclusion of a dedicated national budget and plans for refugees and displaced populations. So advocating for greater and more predictable financing for humanitarian education initiatives really must be at the top of our political agenda. And we are happy to say that although 40% of crisis affected member states have already endorsed a call to action, we see that the responsibility sharing, especially with the donor community, will now have to take charge. So moving forward, UNESCO, we are closely working together with our partners, particularly with our co-convener of the call to action, UNHCR, UNICEF, ECW, GPE, and the co-conveners to ensure that the inclusion of refugees and displaced population will remain a central focus of the operationalization of the agenda for the call to action, and particularly this year, given that the Global Refugee Forum is coming up at the end of the year, which is first a major key milestone of the call to action in operation. Thank you, Becky.
Great, thank you so much. And I think this point of recognizing how far things have moved in terms of political commitment, the enabling policy environment, and the number of countries who really have put in place the parameters where refugees can be included into the national systems has been a huge success. And now the need to match that with financing, predictable multi-year financing that can actually support that national system, so it works for refugees and for host communities. And with that, I'm really pleased to turn to Dr. Agui Kipenge, here from the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development for Uganda. Dr. Kipenge, Uganda has really, for a long time, been one of the major refugee hosting countries worldwide. And we actually just want to thank you again and recognise that generosity in continuing to care for and support people. Responsibility sharing, as Maki had talked about, is outlined specifically in the Global Compact on refugees as a core tenet. When it comes to financially sharing responsibility for providing education for refugees, what are some of the key lessons that you can share from Uganda?
Thank you, Becky, for acknowledging that Uganda has refugee-friendly policies and plans that include provision of various rights to the refugees and asylum seekers, and these rights include right to education, to work, private property, and health care. And at the moment, the country hosts about 1.53 million refugees, 59% of whom are children and youth. These have been, the current location of these refugees is in places where land has been provided, especially by communities or by government itself. In the SDG 4 spirit of leaving no child behind, government in 2018, I was then at the Ministry of Education and Sports before I moved to now the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, launched the Education Response Plan for refugees and host communities, which is a multi-year plan for the provision of education to 567,500 children and youth in the refugee hosting areas. Over 3.5 years, we expected to implement this plan at a cost of 389 million United States dollars. Uganda recognizes the fact that quality education is central and logical to achieving all other sustainable development goals, strengthening the odds for prevention of conflict, maintaining peace and security, and advancing economic development. And this plan laid out country priorities for urgent attention, including pathways for humanitarian and development partners to work with the district, local governments, or government at the subnational level, and our development partners in communities that are most impacted by the refugee influx. We also established a secretariat at the ministry responsible for education to deliberately help align planning and service delivery for refugees and host communities to support coordination and provision of technical support and harmonize initiatives within the sector plan. Of course, this plan has ended. It was a 3-year plan from 2018 to 2021, completed in 2022. And we are now working as a country on the ERP2, that is the Education Response Plan. It contributed to coordination planning and information management. And as a result, the gross enrollment ratio of refugees in at the primary education level improved from 58.2% in 2017-2018 to 88.5% over the 3-year period. Partners also reported increased funds mobilization due to documentation of the prioritized activities, and Uganda appreciates this support from bilateral donors, partners, and agencies. What are the lessons on financial responsibility sharing, therefore, in Uganda? Now, besides the support from bilateral donors through partners such as the 42 million United States dollars from ECW, 7 million from ECHO, agencies and private foundations, the major income streams for financial support were conditional grants received from the World Bank through the Development Response to Displacement Impacts Project, which was a 50 million credit and 100 million grant from the bank, and the Uganda Intergovernmental Fiscal Transfers Program, abbreviated as UGIP, through which 51 primary schools were transitioned from community/private schools to government-aided ones for a period of 3 years. However, such on-budget support requires predictable multi-year funding for sustainability. Secondly, we've had high enrollment of learners with a limited resource envelope from government of Uganda, which means that partners, agencies still continue to support, for example, in the area of teacher salaries and in these transitional institutions. Lesson 1, we need to reflect how income streams into the country through the education development partners, international NGOs, foundations, and private sector meaningfully and sustainably target education service delivery to youth, school-going and out-of-school children and youth. Secondly, and most importantly, we need to appreciate how needs at country system level and structural level are being supported, especially where education in the country is heavily supported by parents, since sustainability is best addressed when stakeholders in education are empowered to handle the challenges and limitations in their unique locations. So education remains a partnership where, in the case of Uganda, it's been established. Government alone does not have the capacity to provide the resources to all, including the refugees. So this particular meeting and effort is very much appreciated, because through the development partners, through Education Cannot Wait and others, we are able to mobilize additional resources that enables us to meet the needs of education for all our people in Uganda, including the refugees.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I think you said so much in that, which is really helpful to the thinking, and also, again, to recognize the extent to which Uganda has put in place amazing opportunities for refugee children and young people. I think you were talking about really recognizing, to include refugees into national systems as the international community, we need to understand how those systems work. Not just in terms of planning, budgeting, timelines, all of the different pieces across the whole of government approach to education, but also actually, who is paying for it, and the role of parents, for example, where refugees in other places don't have the right to work and kind of aren't earning money to be able to put money into that system and pay for what would be household costs for host communities. So I think that piece around policy and planning is really critical. And I think you spoke very eloquently to the need to then match that policy and planning work that's done at national level with multi-year predictable financing, with the kind of financing that the government can count on to be able to make the sort of commitments that last for the long term. And they do need to last for the long term, because, as you said, quality education is central not just to human development, but to a lot of the issues that mean people become refugees in the first place. So looking at conflict resolution, climate resilience, all of those different pieces. So bringing those pieces together, I think, has been incredibly helpful in our reflections. On which note, I'm going to turn to Parag Power, who is the Chief Financial Officer for the Global Partnership for Education. Parag, GPE has been a long-standing advocate for refugees and displaced populations and made a pledge at the 2019 Global Refugee Forum exactly on this piece, looking at trying to harmonise and increase financing for refugees. That pledge was made along with ECW and with the World Bank. What progress have you seen, but what more do you think is needed to advance inclusion in GPE partner countries?
Thank you. Thank you, Becky, and thanks to UNHCR for convening this session. It's an honor to be here on this panel with so many GPE partner organizations and countries. I think let's start with some of the magnitude of the challenge. At the end of 2021, we had 13.7 million children were refugees or asylum seekers, and a further 22.8 million children were internally displaced. So that's more than double the number of child refugees compared to 2005. I think we've all seen over the course of 2022 the events that number has likely grown again. So given the scale of the challenge, it's clear that more and better financing for education for refugee and displaced children is required. So as Becky mentioned, GPE did pledge at the first Global Refugee Forum in December 2019. We pledged to support inclusive and resilient systems to support quality education for refugees and more and better financing to scale up learning. So this includes financial and technical support to develop and pursue national sector plans that include refugees, increasing accelerated financing in emergencies and protracted crisis, mobilizing additional finance to support refugee children through our innovative finance mechanism, the GPE multiplier, and working with partners to ensure sustainable complementary financing. So we did make that pledge alongside Education Cannot Wait and alongside the World Bank, and we committed collectively to improve collaboration, coordination, and financing of global efforts in support of education for refugees and host communities. So maybe the best way to share some of the examples of the progress on that pledge is to give you a couple of examples of how that's working in some of our partner countries. So at the moment in Kenya, GPE and the World Bank are working together through the Primary Education Equity and Learning Programme. That includes an initial 140 million IDA credit and an additional 60 million from the World Bank for the window for host communities and refugees. And that's combined with 117 million in financing from GPE, which actually includes 10 million from the Lego Foundation, which has helped us unlock the multiplier innovative finance mechanism. So within this package of funding, it includes support for refugee students through scholarships, results-based school grants, and school meals. As we've just heard from our colleague in Uganda, there's been a lot of progress made on refugee education, and GPE's forthcoming program, which is under development at the moment, will be aligned to the current ECW multi-year resilience program, which runs until the end of 2023. So this is a major step forward towards a fully inclusive refugee education system. For example, a new EMIS system under development will include refugees, and GPE and ECW are continuing to collaborate on issues such as funding for refugee teacher salaries, which is part of the current ECW multi-year resilience program, but it requires longer term and larger financing. Becky, you asked what more do we think is needed? More financing is needed for a start. We're now 5 months on from the Transforming Education Summit, where GPE and other partners joined the Education in Emergencies and Protracted Crisis Commitment to Action. We're less than a year away from the second Global Refugee Forum. And GPE partner countries, they need to see this global responsibility sharing that the first Global Refugee Forum called for. So we urgently need to protect and increase financing to education, both through aid, but also domestic financing. We need a fully funded GPE and ECW, and we need to continue to work together as we do to ensure financing is equitable and aligned with national planning priorities. At the moment, many countries, many GPE partner countries are developing what are called partnership compacts. Uganda has gone through that process last year to really focus on what are the priorities that will support system transformation in each of their own countries. And this is really a chance for governments to commit to the inclusion of refugee children and for partners to align support and resources to match that vision. So if we are to achieve quality education for all, we must include all refugees and displaced children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's a real call to action. It's not just about looking at different kinds of financing, innovative opportunities, the need for multi-year and predictable financing, but actually there are points where there just needs to be more. And it's okay to keep saying that. And I think we heard this at the Transforming Education Summit as well. I think also you talked about the need for collective commitment and for collaboration. So it's not just recognizing the policy and planning environment and trying to speak to that, but actually how do we as the international community make it easier, make it simpler, and make it work more effectively? You also talked a bit about partnership. And I'm going to turn now to Emily Friedman, who's the head of business impact at the Global Business Coalition for Education. And in the financing education landscape, business has a really important role to play. Parag just talked about how Lego Foundation's contribution unlocked additional financing and was really able to facilitate additional money going into the system. What are some of the ways that business can contribute to financing education, particularly as it relates to refugees and host communities?
Thank you, Becky, and thanks for convening this panel, and it's a really important topic. As the Global Business Coalition for Education, we work to mobilize businesses towards supporting the global education crisis on the whole. There are companies for whom this means an interest in issues related to refugees and crises. There are some where they're interested in the education landscape overall, how it relates to skills, how it relates to talent pipelines. There are very many ways that the business community can sort of engage in education. But when we talk about disaster settings or crises, there is often sort of a lack of information going to the private sector about what is actually needed on the ground to support education in the long run. And I think a lot of times the business community will make a quick donation or pledge to address the crisis at the moment of a disaster. And so what we've started thinking about really recently is how can we mobilize the goodwill, because there is on the part of the business community an interest to support sort of longer term education initiatives for refugees and displaced students, and how can we sort of work to mobilize these funds in line with what's happening on the ground, what national governments are saying they actually need, so that there's not a mismatch between sort of a quick influx of money to address an issue, but there's sort of a longer term strategic plan. So in 2022, GBC Education established, or so really recently, it was actually the past few months, our Disaster Relief and Education Response Fund, sort of as a way to, one, open up that channel of communication. So we're providing businesses with streamlined information about the crisis, vetted partners on the ground with whom they may be able to work longer term, and listening to sort of what the global education community is saying is needed at that moment, and how can we then sort of translate that into something tangible that the business community can do. So there are a few different ways that obviously that the business community can contribute in terms of actual financing, so funding, depending on the organization that would be receiving the funds. There are some ways to leverage that financing, as I know Parag has talked about, through GPE. We're also interested in looking kind of further ahead at the International Finance Facility for Education and how businesses might be able to leverage their investments there for kind of longer term restructuring on the ground. But what we found sort of as our pilot case for this particular new initiative was that the government of Ukraine had a real need for laptops and learning devices immediately. And so they were looking for very specific devices that had particular capabilities, software, language, all sorts of specifications that needed to be communicated to the business community and needed to be really in line with what government and other partners were doing. So we worked really closely, first of all, with the international community. We worked with ECW and the government on the ground in Ukraine to understand sort of what was the greatest need and how could we sort of match that. So in this case, and I want to make sure I get this right, so HP in this case financed the devices, supply chain, and shipping. Microsoft financed the software, and the local government financed the storage, the local distribution, and training. So it's a real partnership where you can see, okay, now the private sector is coming in a meaningful way, not just sending funds to something that might be sort of used for a one-off kind of Band-Aid solution, but looking longer term at what the government actually needs. And actually through this partnership, we mobilized more than $38 million, in total from the business community to support Ukrainian, support education for these refugee children inside Ukraine and displaced children outside of Ukraine. And that will impact the lives of about 4 million children, it's projected, given that a lot of this was through to support teachers. So our hope is that this model gains traction, that we can work closely with GPE, that we are speaking with some of your colleagues, Parag, for how can we take this model and adjust it to other situations as well. We'll continue our partnership with ECW and just try to, I think we were talking a little bit before the panel, but just come up with a more sort of joined up approach that involves the business community in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I mean, I think talking about mobilizing, towards the global education crisis is exactly what we've been looking at with this, not just trying to amplify and talk about the needs that are there, but really looking at the different roles that different organizations and different pillars across those stakeholders can play. I think you also helped us think about what is the kind of data and evidence that we're putting out there. Just kind of asking is not enough, right? Being really specific. What are the needs as led by ministries? What do ministries want? How does it fit in with their planning? What are the gaps? And how do we then come together to respond to that in a real partnership and a really meaningful way? I think with that kind of thinking about the data and the evidence and being really clear in terms of what are the asks, I'm pleased to turn to Safah El Kogali, the Education Practice Manager for East and Southern Africa at the World Bank. We've mentioned the World Bank a number of times in this conversation. And I think we've really spoken to the specific needs of refugees and talked about what is actually required and why there are critical different approaches with each kind of different stakeholder. But can you tell us about some of the findings of the refugee education costing work that the World Bank did with UNHCR? What is the importance of that work? And based on the findings of that report, what is your call to action as we collectively head towards the Global Refugee Forum in December?
Thanks very much, Becky, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm glad to hear the interventions from colleagues on the panel. I agree with everything they say, and I think this report captures a lot of that. But let me just start by saying this is really personally a very important agenda for me. I'm from Sudan, and I grew up seeing so many refugees around me that really shaped the way I think about things. And it's incredible that as a child, as a young person, and now as an adult and as a professional, we're still dealing with this. So this is not going away. This is something that will continue. And now as we see climate change and all other global crises that will impact populations around the world, we really need to continue to think about much more sustainable financing and models that would work, that would support those countries that are impacted the most. And so we see the issue of refugee education as really a global public good. Most of the onus falls on low and middle income countries. And so just some numbers, around 3/4 of school-age refugees reside in 25 low and middle income countries that are the most highly impacted. So when we keep that in mind, the support for these countries becomes very important and very urgent. The report that you mentioned, Becky, provides a framework for more equitable, sustainable, and efficient financing of refugee education. And in that report, we call for a more inclusive approach to integration. And I heard a lot of my colleagues here speak about that. I mean, inclusive refugee education is where the refugees are integrated in the school systems in the host countries. It's recognized, we have evidence that this is the most durable and sustainable solution to the refugee education crisis. Investments, and I don't want to be preaching to the converted, but really the investments in inclusive education will provide net positive revenue streams to host governments over the long term. So in this sense, refugees can actually be an asset and not just a burden. And I think that message needs to be reiterated over and over again as we communicate with potential supporters, but also with host countries. But the host countries also face a lot of political and financial challenges to investing in education broadly, and not just for the refugees. And so there are high upfront costs when they need to include the large number of refugee children coming into their education system. And there are also lots of financial risks because investing in a potentially transient population of very scarce resources becomes a challenge for them. So in this scenario, where there is the potential of refugees returning to their home country, some of those host countries believe that those investments could be put elsewhere. And so given those challenges, the report argues that the global donor community has a responsibility to contribute more to address the education needs of refugees, and they should be prioritizing investments in the context of national education systems. With the gradual transition towards greater host country responsibility. So upfront investments are going to be super critical. And then to support countries to continue using their own resources. In fact, it's the national governments that are spending the most on education for refugees. What is brought in from the global community is really a drop in the ocean compared to what countries are doing. And we need to recognize that as we continue to support them. The report also provides a framework to guide donor allocations where they should align funding priorities around two key considerations: the refugee needs, but also the sustainability factor. And when we talk about refugee needs, we refer to educational quality and inequalities facing school-age refugees. For example, I saw in Lebanon, the schools that were hosting some of the refugee kids, the quality of education was much lower than in other schools, because other schools were trying not to take in the refugee kids, arguing about quality of their education. And so looking at these inequities is going to be very important when we support governments in terms of supporting refugee education. The sustainability aspect I mentioned, but it really refers to the degree to which host governments are committed to enacting inclusive policies with respect to refugees. I'll give you another example where there were a lot of Syrian teachers as refugees at the outbreak of the Syrian crisis in Lebanon, but the government was not allowing them to teach in the schools. And they are a resource. And through dialogue and discussions, they eventually agreed that having a Syrian teacher in a classroom actually helped those kids learn more because of the accent, sometimes just the expression that was being used. And so the government realized that there was actually a benefit by having these teachers there. So sometimes these models, introducing them to governments, lead them to opening up a little bit more and allowing refugee teachers as well as students to be part of the system. We at the World Bank are very committed to supporting refugees and more generally working in contexts that are fragile, conflict affected and vulnerable, the FCV context as we call them. They make up around a quarter of our education portfolio. And currently we have about 19 projects in our active education portfolio that are supporting refugees in 15 countries across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and more recently, Eastern Europe with the Ukraine crisis. What we try to do is really use the IDA resources that we have to leverage more resources. So we work a lot with the Global Partnership for Education, tapping into the multiplier resources, allowing us to get even more financing to governments as much as possible, partnering with other agencies who are interested in that. In terms of we need to also be innovative in how we can release some of the funding. So for example, we have projects in Moldova, in Romania, and when the Ukraine crisis came about, we repurposed some of the grants so that they can target high schools and universities that were accepting some of the Ukraine refugees to ensure the continuation of their education. So that flexibility with the funding and the ability to move it between different projects, I think becomes very, very important. So in terms of our call for action, I'd like to reiterate what my colleagues have mentioned, the need to continue to ensure financing, but not only the stock, but also the flow. We will continue to have refugees around the world, and we need to be thinking ahead and not just what we have right now, which is already huge. And so working with government systems, as my colleague from Uganda mentioned, is going to be super important. They know what's happening in their countries, and we need to help them meet those needs more than ever. I think we need to coordinate and complement each other in the financing that we put forward. There are lots of initiatives. I think the closer we come, the more impactful we are in these countries. Sharing data, sharing information, which is the costing that the World Bank has done, is very important because it informs us where we need to focus, where the needs are greatest, looking at what works and sharing that, like what we've heard now about Uganda and what we know in Kenya or in Lebanon. Sharing that widely becomes important also for this financing to really reach those who need it the most. And finally, I just want to paraphrase a Margaret Mead quote where she says, "It only takes a handful of responsible people to change the world." But I think it might take even fewer people to be able to make a positive difference in the lives of refugees. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I know we're being called back to plenary, so instead of handing back to the guests, I will just make a few closing remarks. I mean, I'm really inspired by this session. I think that we've talked about the scale of the need, and we've talked about how much it's growing, and climate responses, conflict. There are a lot of reasons why we can expect to see more displacement. But actually there have been such huge shifts, not just with host governments, but from GPE, from the bank, from UNESCO, with IIEP, like the way we're all working together means that I think there is enough recognition across stakeholders to start to come up with some of the solutions. I think, Safah, you talked about innovation, and it's a really important one. Emily, you'd mentioned IFED, we talk about innovative financing, but I think also recognizing that communities themselves have been innovating for decades in terms of how they're able to integrate refugees, and being able to take some of those lessons, look at the way government systems and planning works, bring them together and support them with financing is really critical as we move ahead. We've talked about kind of different moments and parts of inclusion. I think it's a really helpful reminder that inclusion is on a continuum. There are people at very different stages, governments at different stages, and also where it can feel or look different at subnational levels as well. And those things also move ahead. And I mean, the example of Sudan has had an amazing enabling policy environment in terms of inclusion in education for a long time, but the shift away from the line ministry responsible for refugees to the Ministry of Education has really facilitated some different kinds of meaningful engagement. We've also talked about investment as a continuum and this need for, actually very high startup costs. When there is an influx, when there's a new population, putting in place the facilities to support them, but also looking at, recognizing refugees as an asset. And I think that also helps us think about the long-term pathways to self-reliance and the point where refugees are, actively in the workforce, able to make their own living, able to pay for education if they need to, but also contributing to the public purse, so that then domestic finance becomes something which is available for all because it's being contributed to by all. And I think I would just close by thinking about, sustainability and what that looks like. And I think we have very long conversations in the international community about sustainability. Sometimes sustainability is actually just magical thinking. And, we've talked about recurrent costs and teacher salaries, really looking at what is needed to be paid for, by whom, for how long, and linking that back to that continuum of investment and self-reliance, I think is really critical as we move ahead, and how all of that contributes to us collectively being more resilient. So thank you so much to our panel, and thank you to you all for coming.
No time for questions?
No, because they're calling the panel, sorry.
But are you sure? Are you sure that if Lebanon, since the example was given, has been through 3 civil wars in the past century and a lot of tension between Lebanese and Palestinians, and if there are more helpless refugees than ever in Syria, it's because these people were not told that they should consider refugees as an asset, and they have been short of funding. This is the question I have in mind, and I'm very, let's say, in disarray with the rhetoric, the narrative I hear at this conference.